Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. The last couple videos have been a little quiet, so I thought I'd pick out something that's a little bit loud, and nothing's much louder than the Traxler Counterattack and the two knights defense. So we're going to do a little overview of this really crazy opening. About 20 years ago, I decided I was really good at using computers to analyze chess games, and I wanted to make use of that, so I said, what could I do to discover that might be interesting, that I could write a book about, that computers could help? And I said, maybe I could take computers and really look deeply in one of the craziest openings, the Traxler Counterattack, and figure out whether or not it's actually sound for black to play this crazy line or not. So I spent about 2 years of my life writing this book that you see on the video right now called the Traxler Counterattack. And it's sold as an ebook from Chess Central here. If the book had been printed out and done in hard copy instead of an ebook, it would be about 1,000 pages long. Originally, they said they would print it out for me and make it a hard copy book as well, but they never did. And I didn't make very much money on the book. But when John Watson reviewed this book, International Master Watson said it was the most comprehensive book he's ever read about anything. And I wrote back to John and I said, well, thanks, John, but I assume you mean about chess and not everything in general. So it was a very, very comprehensive book. Now, using two computers to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning every night for 2 years gave me an awful lot of analysis. But of course, computers today are even better and even faster. So some of the things that would take me hours and hours and hours and hours can actually be done in a few minutes today, or even less. So when we turn on the engine later in the video, you'll see what the people who have put this on the cloud have thought about these moves. And we're not going to do any kind of the 1,000-page comprehension in a 20-minute video, but we will give some overview. All right, so let's go to the board now. Here's a board. And what is the Traxler Counterattack? The Traxler Counterattack is after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. White plays the Italian game, bishop c4. Now, if you want to be in the Traxler, you can't play a gioco piano, bishop c5. You have to play a two knights defense. And now the main grandmaster line is d3. We can see it here in the database. The master database, well, let me move the database over so you can see it, because right now you can't see the database. All right, let's put the database to the right. All right, you should be able to see the board and the database now. All right. So you can see d3 was played 10,600 times, and the old main line, knight g5, was only played 2,600 times. So modern grandmasters want to play this like a gioco pianissimo. But let's say black plays the old main line with knight to g5. And now the Traxler counterattack is to just give him this f7 square and play bishop c5 and counterattack. And you could see out of 2,632 games at the master level, the main line was played 2,500 times and bishop c5 was only played 128. And white did pretty well with the Traxler here at the master level. If we go down to the LiChess level, you can see it's completely different. Now, bishop c5 actually won 50% of the games with black at the amateur level. That's a high percentage of wins for black. Okay, back to the master database. All right, so let's go through the main line first real quick, which we've already done in previous videos, just for people that aren't familiar with this. Everybody understands that if you don't want to play the Traxler, you have to block the attack on f7 with d5, and after he takes, amateurs almost always take knight takes, which is the natural recapture, and I did that too when I was an amateur, but it's actually a pretty big mistake. You can see in grandmaster games, out of 2,500 games, only 26 times did they play knight takes d5, and that was probably on purpose for some reason. But knight takes d5 is a pretty big mistake. And now, if you do this, white can play knight takes f7, which is the fried liver attack, or he can play the lolly, d4. Excuse me. Both the computer's analysis have shown that both of these are very good. Let's turn on the engine here. Depth 47. The depth 47 cloud from Stockfish 14 Plus likes knight takes f7 at 0.9 and d4 at 0.7. It's actually pretty close when you look at the main lines. And I wrote articles about this in New in Chess Yearbook, which got published about the lines in comparing the Lolly to the fried liver attack. So not only was I considered kind of an expert on the Traxler, but also on how white should proceed in these lines. Like, what's the best line to play in the Lolly or to defend against the Lolly? All right, so that's a little outside the scope of the video. What you're supposed to do, by far, as you can see, the computer says, by 7/10 of a pawn, the best move is knight to a5. And then the game usually continues. Bishop checks, c6, pawn takes, pawn takes. And now there's lots of lines. The main line is bishop e2. The computer line, which is now being played by masters, is bishop d3. The sharp line is queen f3. Those are all interesting lines that can be played. And you can see it's pretty much close to equality with each one. And that's why grandmasters are playing d3 on the fourth move instead of knight g5. Because in this line, black is pretty much getting equality. So what is this Traxler thing? Well, let's go back to the start. In the Traxler, I love the way they keep those lines on there. In the Traxler, black says, go ahead and take my pawn. All right, and now we can see that the cloud has a depth of 43, and almost everybody plays knight takes f7 to win the pawn and fork the queen and the rook. And that's the fun line. But actually, the engine says, if you want to chicken out and just take the pawn with the bishop to stop him from castling, and then he plays king here. He doesn't want to block the rook from the semi-open file. And then if you just move your bishop back, the engine suggests either bishop b3, bishop c4. I think if we were on the previous move, where it was 47 ply, it said bishop b3 was the best move. Somebody didn't let it think as long on this ply, and they think bishop c4. But either way, white has a nice advantage. So if you don't want to learn all these complicated lines that we're about to talk about, you can just play this line if you're white and put your bishop back on c4 or b3 or even d5, which used to be the old main line, and you're perfectly okay. Let's look at the fun lines, the knight takes lines. Knight takes f7. And you might say, why would black ever allow this? Let's make this the main line over here. Make main line. Okay. So, in the master database, this was only played 27 times. And, white won a lot, black won a lot. There wasn't very many draws. In the amateur games, this move, bishop takes f2 check now, was played 159,000 times. Look at how well it did. Black won 56% compared to white's 41. Now, notice the difference between the database and the engine. The engine says if white plays perfectly, he can be up by about half a pawn. But yet black's winning most of the games because usually white doesn't know this as well. And it's very easy for white to go wrong. So therefore it's a very fun line to play for black. So bishop takes check. And now there's two main lines. There's the capture line and there's the king to f1 line. Again, most amateurs take the bishop because they figure, oh, he's just desperate because I forked this king and my queen. So let's look at that first. We'll look at king takes f2. That was played almost as many times as king f1 in the amateur database. King f2. And now black has to play knight takes e4 check. And here white has a choice between g1 and e3. All the other moves lose. Can I prove that? Sure. Let's pick one. Let's say he goes back where he came from. King to h1. e1, sorry. Queen h4 check. g3. Knight takes g3. Sneaky pin. You're threatening a discovered attack here. There's really not much defense. Let's say I don't know. Everything loses. The engine says the best try is pawn takes, queen takes, and now if the king comes up, then knight d4 check removes the guard on the queen and wins the queen. So bishop to f1, and now white can just castle. Believe it or not, legal. Skewering the knight to the bishop with mate. Queen e2. Now that knight d4 move again. How about trading queens? No thank you. Trying to get the pieces out. Queen takes. Already you can see black is up the exchange in 2 pawns, and the engine has him up 10 pawns. Let's go back. Let's start from the start again. Alright, so we said he has to go g1 or e3. We just showed what happened on e1. All the other moves are just losing. Let's look at king to g1. Queen h4, threatening mate on f2. White has lots of defenses, but they all lead to draws. You can see it's all 0-0 here. Let's try queen e2. Knight d4. Queen e3. Knight takes c2. Queen back, says let's try to just get a draw. Rook to f8. He could get his draw with knight to d4. g3, counterattacking. Queen e7. Threatening to come up this way this time. Queen takes e4. Knight takes a1. Knight c3. c6, threatening forks and removing the guard on the knight. And with perfect play, black's a little bit better here. It says about -1 pawn. Let's raise this line up to the main line. Alright, so queen h4. He doesn't have to play queen h2. Let's say he plays g3 this time. Again, we sack. If he takes, we check. He has to go here. And now we have the typical d5 sacrifice to get the bishop in the game, which draws. Let's take a look at that. d5. Bishop takes. And now rook f8, pinning the knight to the king. Queen f3. Could also play knight c3. Queen takes. Bishop takes. Rook takes. King g2. And it gives knight to d4 equal here. Black is down a piece, but he's threatening to take this pawn and the bishop, and he has 2 extra pawns. Bishop e4. Bishop f5, removing the guard. And we got 0-0 again. Okay, so what we're seeing here is this king g1 line, if both sides play perfectly, should lead to a draw. Let's look at the other main line. King to e3. When I was doing the book 20 years ago, I came to the conclusion if white wanted to win, king e3 was his only try. We can even make this the main line for the moment. Make main line. Alright, so in this line, black plays queen h4. You can see it was played 16,000 times in amateur games. g3, only move to save the game. White has always these only moves to save the game, which means if you know these lines for black and they don't know them for white, you're probably just going to win game after game after game, although there's a lot to learn, obviously. g3, crazy stuff. Knight takes again. Pawn takes. Queen checks. King f3. Castle, common idea, pinning that knight. Rook h4, I remember studying this 20 years ago, trying to figure out who in the heck's winning here. e4 check, this is all forced. The engines quickly point out that there's only one move. When there's only one move, you can keep going. Queen takes c4. Knight to g5. And now the obvious queen to d4. Why would we know that? Nobody would know that. Queen d4 threatening to go on to f2. Queen e2 guarding f2. d5. So right now, black is down a piece for 2 pawns, but the white king is exposed. d3 getting the pieces out. Knight e5 getting more pieces around the king. Knight c3 threatening to dissolve the center. h6 get that knight out of there before he takes the pawn. Bishop e3, where's your queen going to go? Queen b4. D takes e4. I'll give you back the piece. White says no thank you, don't want the piece. White says go ahead and take my rook. Black says okay. Nobody's going to remember all this, but if it's a correspondence game, well, that's different. You're allowed to use opening books, you're allowed to use videos, you're allowed to use anything you want. Knight e7 check. King h8. Bishop f4. Now the engine seems to think white has a little more than a normal opening advantage. Maybe about half a pawn. Maybe black could have done a little better somewhere. He had some choices. But this is the kind of game that you get. Crazy game. If you're good at tactics, you'll love this opening. All right, let's go back again. Let's go all the way back to the start. Okay. Knight takes f7, the fun line. Bishop takes check. King takes. We'll look at king e3 one more time, and then we'll look at king f1 after, instead of king takes f2. Knight takes, king e3, queen g4, queen h4. Okay, so in this position, we played g3, but, you know, that's just one line. There's a million lines. But it's the only line that you see the engine says is getting a draw. But queen f3 was played the most times, even though it loses. Let's see why. Queen f3. Engine says just play knight f6. Save the knight. Black's threatening to take the bishop. You might ask, why doesn't he take the rook? Well, if he takes the rook, black can play moves like this, hitting the queen. He tries to save the queen. Where would a human save the queen here? I don't know. Queen g3, queen h3. Just for the fun of it, we'll try queen g3. Oh, that's a fork. Check. I guess not. Let's try queen h3. Oh, Mr. Stockfish, you jumped ahead here. King e3. Queen f3. Knight f6. Knight h8. Knight d4. Let's try queen h3, but then it's mate in a couple, right? Yeah. Queen f4 check. King d3. Queen e4 check. King c5. Knight d5 check. Bishop takes d5. This is fun. Queen c2 check. King b4. a5 check. King a3. Knight b5 mate. All right, let's go back. So taking the rook is no good. Let's say he just guards the bishop with d3. All right, then the engine says the best move. It says black has lots of winning moves like d5, which is a thematic move. The best move, it says, is hitting the queen. And now it says white should just give up the queen. Well, we know what happens on that. So let's try to save the queen and show what happens. That's what humans do. They try to save. We already saw queen g3 leads to a knight fork. Queen to h3 allows mate in 1. So let's not allow mate in 1. Let's move the queen where we can stop queen f4 mate. Let's play queen to f1. Now the computer says we have that thematic d5 hitting the bishop and removing the guard on the knight. What would a human play here? A human might take the rook. Let's take the rook. If you move the bishop, he can take the knight. So let's take the rook. Engine says mate in 11. Queen g5 check. King f2. Knight g4 check. And now if king g1, knight e2 check, and if he takes with the queen, then queen takes his mate. Wow, let's look at that. That's very cute. He has to take. It's his only legal move. Check. Here. Check. Here. Mate. Okay, let's go back a couple moves. So he has to play king to g3 instead of king to g1. So let's do that. King g3. Knight e3, discover check, winning the queen. That's all we really need to see. King f1. Black says, I don't need to take the queen. I can mate him. Check. King here, so the rook can guard the queen. Check here. Bishop checks. This is getting overwhelming. Queen f3. You get the idea. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen checks. King here. And he says, take the bishop and mate in 3. Okay, well, back to the game. Or not back to the game, but back to the line we're looking at, which is we just looked at queen to f3. We're trying to explain why g3 is the only move, but you can see all these lines are so tactical. They're so complicated. There's so many mating attacks. The material's so imbalanced. That's why I picked this opening to analyze with the engine, because it's one of the craziest openings in all of chess. Alright, so we can see here that after king e3, if white plays perfectly again with g3, he's got his equality. Alright, let's go look at the king f1 line. That's the other major line. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c5, knight f3, knight g5, bishop c5, knight takes f7, bishop takes. And now we're going to do king f1. That's the move the engine says is the best, and that's the one that was played the most in the master database and in the regular player database. King f1. No thank you. Now the move is to save the queen with queen e7, since you don't have the knight takes check. White says, now I can take the rook. Black says, let's sack the pawn. White says, let's take it. Black says, all right, I'm going to bring my knight out and threaten to like trap your queen. And now the key move, the one that I analyzed for like a year, was d6. The computer kept saying that's the white's only chance to get an advantage. And I didn't know whether pawn takes or queen takes was better, but now we do. The engine running at depth 30 says that pawn takes loses. Let's take a look at that real quick. Pawn takes loses for black after king takes, bishop g4, queen f1, castle queenside, and white's advantage is growing. He could even try to bring his knight back out, or he can drive the bishop away, and black just doesn't have a big enough attack. So let's go back and play the right move, which is to take with the queen. I think I probably figured that out. It's been a while. So now he could get the knight out with tempo and play knight f7. And I thought for a long time, in my analysis years ago, that queen c5 was the best move here. At depth 39, Stockfish 14 says it's queen e7. So let's play queen e7. And now he's got c3, h3, d3, all these different tries. d3 is to get out his pieces. c3 is to drive away the black pieces. h3 is to prevent the bishop from coming to g4 with tempo. Let's try c3 for the fun of it. c3, bishop g4, queen checks, only move. Knight d7, only move. Always hard to figure these things out. King takes f2, queen h4 check. As I said, nobody gets to memorize all these lines, though if you go over them for 2 years like I did, I didn't memorize them, but I got pretty familiar with them. King to f1, it also says king e3 draws. And now the obvious bishop h5, yeah, obvious. He takes the knight. Queen checks, might have a perpetual check here. And we do. If he plays over here, we keep checking him. If he puts the pawn up, I get to check him here and attack the rook. That could be bad for him. Let's see here. g3, queen checks, king f2, It says that's a draw too. Queen takes h1. And now queen to b3. Interesting line. Queen to b3. And he doesn't take the bishop. He just takes the pawn check. Queen h2. King f1. And he could keep checking with a draw here. All right, so back to equality. So queen takes d6, knight f7. As I said, the old line that I looked at was queen c5 here. But the engine now says queen e7 is better. We just looked at c3. Let's look at one more line and we'll call it a day. Let's say he plays h3 to stop the bishop from going to g4. Then the bishop saves itself with bishop h4. Now c3. Now it says the knight should play to f5 with ideas of going into dark squares. d4, trying to get back in the game and get the center. Black actually takes it. Amazing. I don't remember seeing this line. White plays knight to g5, guarded by the bishop. Now black has three lines. d3 check, knight g3 check, knight e3 check. They're all 0, 0, 0. You do get some of these perpetual checks in these crazy lines. It's not uncommon. Well, let's just pick one and we'll call it a day. Most humans would like to fork the rook and the king. We'll do that. King to g1. And now the only move to draw, d3. Did you all see that? Good thing we have an engine here to help us. d3. Bishop takes d3. Best way to play. Bishop f5. And now the engine's thinking. Everything is 0, 0 or worse. All right, well, we could stop here. You get the idea. All right, let's just review what we learned. We learned from the very start that if you play bishop c5 right away, you're in a Joko piano and none of this can happen. If you play two knights defense and white plays the modern line, d3, none of this can happen. If white plays the old main line, knight g5, and you want to play the main line with d5, just don't fall into the lolly or the fried liver. Don't play knight takes d5. Play knight a5. But if you want an alternative to d5, bishop c5. And now if white wants to avoid all the main craziness, white can play bishop takes f7 check. Black should play king e7. And now all the bishop retreats are reasonable. Bishop c4, bishop d5, bishop b3. I think the previous level said that bishop b3 was a little bit the best. Here it says bishop c4 is the best. In master games, bishop d5, which is the old main line, was played the most. And of course all the fun starts with knight takes f7, bishop takes check. If white takes, we saw this probably leads to equality. If white knows to play king g1 or king e3. Or white can decline, playing the line we just looked at with queen e7. Knight takes, and now black has to play the thematic d5. And black gets a good attack, but if white plays perfectly, maybe white can get a slight advantage here. So the Traxler is actually still considered a viable opening. All right, so compared to the kind of the talky kind of videos we had before, I thought we'd have some real big action on the board today. Hope you enjoyed it. Tell your friends about my channel. I've got videos on almost every single aspect of chess improvement. I'm an expert on all the kind of things that people do, amateurs do wrong, and how to recognize them, how to work on them, how to fix them. So, see you next time.